Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation. So we are doing an analysis of English fluency for a post-higher education immersion, and we're looking at a study of a Vietnamese-speaking undergraduate in a Southern U.S. university. And we are presenting with Avery Davis, Ainsley Gordon, and Grace Keaton. So the overview of this project, we'll first start out with an introduction, which looks over the overview of the project experiment, and then we'll move on to the background of the subject and their country. Then we'll look at the details of the study and how it was presented. Then we'll go over the findings, looking at the phonological, morphological, and syntactical findings, and then we'll look at the teaching recommendations for each of those as well, and then we'll conclude with all of the things that we have presented today.
So now we'll be moving on to our introduction. Our subject's L2 was Vietnamese, which is what this presentation will mostly be talking about. Vietnamese speakers are growing in the US every year. Vietnam as a country is one of the top 20 biggest countries in the world, and there are over 75 million Vietnamese speakers and 1.5 million are in the US, according to statistics from 2019. There's a lot of immigration coming from Vietnam to the United States because of job opportunities, and immigration laws are becoming more expansive. So there's going to be a lot more individuals who have Vietnamese as their L1 learning English as their second language. So a lot of learning is going to be taking place, and this is where the congruence hypothesis applies. The congruence hypothesis is essentially the idea that familiar concepts from an individual's L1 is going to transfer to their L2 more easily because the subject already knows that convention. So for example, the way nouns function in an L1, if they function similarly in an L2, that learning process will be quicker and more efficient than, say, a foreign concept that is only available in the L2. Foreign concepts that are only in the L2 are going to take much longer to master than familiar concepts. So we're going to find this in phonology, morphology, and syntax. So now we can move on to the background, which includes our subject and the language in more specific terms. So our subject is a Vietnamese speaker who is fluent in English. He's a 24-year-old male. He was born in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, which is located in the southern portion. He moved to the US in 2012, so that means he has been immersed in United States culture for about 9 years. And he is currently an engineering major at WKU. So he began academic English at age 10 in public Vietnamese schools as well as private tutoring, but he was not immersed into an English-speaking culture until about age 15 when he moved to the US. So some conventions of Vietnamese that we found that are significant to our research are presented here. So one is their phonetic inventory varies differently than a lot of English. Here's a list of all the consonant phonemes found, and you can see that it's lacking fricatives and more complex sounds that are found in English. Another significant convention is that they do not have verb conjugation. Instead, they have auxiliary verbs that precede the verb. And they also have a unique determiner system. There is no Vietnamese equivalent for the word a, and the word the has many different classifications that English does not.
So now we'll be moving on to the details of the study. Going over the materials that we used for the experiment, all of the interview was recorded on a Zoom platform so that it took over all of the phonological and other like syntax and morphology that was spoken aloud. Then a paper and pencil were taken to record the written prompt portion of the test. And then a packet with interview questions and the speaking prompt was also provided during the interview. So basically this design was, or this experiment was designed to elicit all three: phonological, morphological, and syntactical production, both looking at the written and verbal sections of all of those three. And it was divided into three different parts. So the first was a recorded interview, the second was a grammar test, and the third was a writing prompt. The recorded interview looked primarily at the morphological and phonological speech production. And then the grammar test looked more at the syntactic and morphological section that looked primarily at the spoken part of it. And then the writing prompt was looking at the written portion of the syntactic and morphological skills that the subject produced. So this is the first interview questions that we asked that looked over all of the phonological and morphological spoken parts of the experiment. So for the basic questions we did to just start it out, we looked at like name, age, gender, and the location that they were born. Then we moved on to more long-winded questions that looked at his experience. And then lastly, we asked about 6 questions that were more philosophical, if that's a way to describe them. Basically, they're long-winded questions that aren't very structured. They're meant to get long, unrehearsed answers out of the subject that looked at basically just childhood memories, different things like fun questions like a genie if they've granted a few wishes, just basically things to get him thinking in more of a loose term rather than thinking very strategically about the answer that he was going to do. And down here, I'm actually going to come back to this page. Down here, you can see finally there was a reading prompt within the interview, and we had him read Arthur the Rat, which has like all of the different types of phonological things that could be brought out by second language speakers. So then we're moving on to the grammar test. It was split into 3 parts. First, it looked at just like having the person look at the grammatical errors of sentences, and that was an example. The second looked at more of a fill in the blank where he had a few choices, and then there was an example of that. And then the last looked at a fill in the blank where he had to conjugate the verbs into the provided sentence. Lastly, we provided 2 questions for him to choose from, and he had a specified time limit just so he would have a time limit so he wouldn't be able to like think about what he was writing. It was more natural coming to him. And we also did this on a piece of pencil and paper so that he wouldn't have a spell check to check him as he was going, or he couldn't like look up something as he was writing it. And these were also just 2 fun questions that we found to bring out a more natural reaction, and so it wasn't as rehearsed, or he was trying to make it very well written versus what would naturally come out of his writing. So now we'll be moving on to the findings for the 3 areas.
So the first findings that we are going to discuss are the phonetics. As you can see here, there are 5 main cases that we are going to discuss that were found both in the interview and in the reading of Arthur the Rat. So the first and foremost, also the most often error that occurred, was stopping. And this is when D was replacing F. So some examples would be the word them, the, this, that, others being pronounced with the D phoneme. So dem, D, this, that, others, etc. So this stopping occurs when a fricative becomes a stop. That's easier transition when you're speaking. One reason for this may be because there are no dental fricatives in Vietnamese. So this eth character is a foreign concept. and D is more commonplace in Vietnamese. A second production error we found is the deletion of consonant clusters, specifically R and L. So some of those examples include mispronouncing old, girl, world, and growled. So these were mostly found in codas, as other consonant clusters were more natural because they're found in Vietnamese, and the speakers also had a lot more practice. But these deletions were mostly found at the end of the word. They were also found when transitioning between words. So one example was the leader, their leader, the transition from the R to the L, even though they were in two different words, it was in the same breath. So that was still had a deletion occur. So the subject is deleting these sounds and phonemes to provide a smoother transition for himself from one alveolar to another. And the liquid transitions are difficult as well when you transition from one liquid to another or a liquid to an alveolar. Some of the reasons this may occur is because R is not found in Vietnamese, so that's a foreign sound. And there are also no coda or word final consonant clusters found in Vietnamese. They almost always end with a vowel. The third production error is syllable simplification. To kind of add on to the consonant clusters, the combination of N and D was usually caused a deletion with D, because the transition from the nasal to a stop was too difficult, so he subconsciously deleted it. This does happen to native speakers occasionally as well, so it's not an incredibly significant finding, but nevertheless, it is still present. The fourth production error is both phonological and morphological. There is a deletion of the ed suffix that happens with verbs. There are several different ways to pronounce ed. When you have a voiced consonant at the end of the infinitive form of a verb, it can be pronounced as ed or d. But with a voiceless consonant at the end of an infinitive verb, you pronounce it as t or t. So the errors were not consistent when he had a voiced consonant. The ed and t pronunciations were usually correct, but it depended on the situation. He was not 100%, he did not have 100% accuracy. Whereas with D, he missed the D sound more than 50% of the time. And some of those examples include mispronouncing answered and seemed. So T might be easier because that is a common final consonant in Vietnamese, but another solution may be because he is not mastered conscious verb conjugation, and we'll discuss more of that later. The final phonological finding was his tonal inflection. And this was more of a holistic viewpoint, but essentially his cadence and rhythm was not of a mainstream American English accent. The stress in individual English words were fine, but the emphasis throughout a sentence or a question would vary. This includes the pitch height and direction. And this is because Vietnamese is a tonal language. English only uses tone for attitude. So this can cause problems when trying to communicate with people. It might be more difficult to understand what his tone may actually be. And this is happening because of the transition from his L1 to his L2. And those are the phonological findings.
So there were three morphological issues that I found. The first one kind of goes together with subject verb agreement and plurality. On both of the findings that I found, he would drop the S on certain words. So for example, when asked about his major, he said, I like how stuff works. That's the subject verb agreement part. So instead of saying I like how stuff works, he dropped the S on work. And in plurality, it was a kind of weird issue that I found. So the sentence was, I take walk in the park. So he dropped the S on the word walks. And so when I look more into it, it's not really the tense of the verb walk. It's more that the verb walk isn't a verb now anymore. It's the indirect object. And so the next thing that I found was pronouns. He forgets to use the pronoun I a lot. And this is a common issue with Vietnamese speakers because there is no equivalent for the pronoun I in Vietnamese. The third thing that I found is that he forgets to use articles, but mostly the article a. And this is also common with Vietnamese speakers because there's no equivalent to the article a.
Okay, so moving on to the written and syntax and morphological findings, I primarily looked at the written prompt that we provided in the experiment. In that experiment, we looked at those two prompts, and he answered, what historical moment or event do you wish you could have witnessed? And in his answer, he explained how he would have liked to witness the events during World War II, which was a very advanced topic, which kind of goes into how advanced his knowledge of English is. And so going through my findings, he actually had very few mistakes, or if he did have mistakes, they weren't super consistent, but there were a few that I found listed here. I found 5 main ones. So the first looks at the conjugation of specifically in the plurality and tense of conjugations. So looking at plurality, he specifically had some issues with determiners and pronouns and like making those agree with the subject at hand. So in one of his sentences, he wrote, I think that the films about this period paint a picture of this ideas. So instead of saying these ideas, which would have made it agree with the subject, he instead put this ideas. So it shows that he used the determiner first in the beginning of the sentence where he said this period correctly, and he kind of pushed that along to the phrase this ideas, where he used this in both senses, but it should have been instead where the ideas is plural, it should have been these. So that was one of the plurality issues. Another one was he looked at and he wrote, I think politicians of modern age should also have this thought as to show them that wars can only bring despair and suffering for people being affected by it. Instead of using the word it in the pronoun, because I think with how it was written, it got confusing, and it sounds correct at first, but because he was trying to replace the word wars, it should have been, he should have used the pronoun them instead of it, because he just mistook the plurality of the issue. And then moving on to the tense issues that he saw, one of the main things that I saw was in the sentence he wrote, I'd have loved to be from England where lots of battlefronts were taking place. Instead of using the phrase were taken, he should have used the word have taken. And while were taken would be used in a different sense, it didn't work in this because he is using a passive phrase instead of the past perfect, which should have been what should be there. Because if he would have said have taken instead of were taken, it would have been correct. But it's seen a lot with specifically Asian speakers that use passive in a lot of different forms that shouldn't be there. But so that's probably the reason why he used that instead. And the last example of the conjugation error was whenever he used the sentence, I'd have loved to know how, I'd have loved to know what life was like during that period and experience what common people were going through. So in this sentence, he writes the word experienced when it should have been written as experience. And when looking at it at the beginning of the sentence, when he said, I'd love to know what life was like during that period, he combined the experience and conjugated it like the word loved, when it should have been, if you condense the sentence, it would have been, I'd have loved to know, or I'd love to experience, but he wrote, I'd have loved to experienced. So basically he took the conjugation of the word love instead of the conjugation of the word know, because he combined those two clauses. And so that was kind of what tripped him up in that. So basically all of these findings of the conjugation issues could be taken back to the issue of the verb conjugation and the similar determiners conjugation in the Vietnamese language as spoken about earlier. Without having this prior knowledge, kind of with the morphological congruence hypothesis, it would be difficult for him to implement this into his language when moving over to English, because it is a completely new concept. And so trying to conjugate all of these verbs while also making them the determiners, which he also doesn't really have in the Vietnamese language, would be hard to kind of all mesh together. And then moving on into the prepositions that he mistook, there was a bit of confusion with this preposition that he wrote. One of the main sentences that I found was in the sentence, or in the fragment of the sentence, the bombardments of London put fear on millions of citizens. This is completely understandable why he made this mistake. Instead of saying the fear was put into the citizens, he said fear was put on. This is normally when people are taught prepositions, it's about the spatial prepositions, as in the cat was next to the barn, the cat was on top of the barn, instead of the abstract prepositions like this instance where the fear was put into them versus on them. Because normally when you put something on someone, that's a more common term than putting something into someone. And so with that, there's a lot of differences between like spatial and abstract prepositions, like in this example of different ways to use the word in. There's a difference between like the cat is in the house versus the bird is in the garden, and the flowers are in the vase versus the bird is in the tree. There's a lot of different like ideas between how each of them are set up, whereas in like the cat is completely in the house versus the bird is like somewhat in the garden, the flowers are somewhat in the vase. There's just a lot of differences between prepositions that we normally don't go over. And from what it seems like, he probably was only taught about the spatial prepositions. Moving on, he did have some punctuation errors, which are common with second language acquisition learners. He had a lot of run-on sentences. Out of the 9 sentences that he wrote, actually 3 of them had used or had combined 3 clauses in itself. And so with that, he had attached conjunctions with a comma to basically keep going. And with that run-on sentence, it just like kept going and kept going where it didn't really make sense anymore. They're all complete in itself, but it shows that like whenever he was learning how to combine the sentences, it might have not been as developed as to show how not to do run-on sentences. Another finding that I found was the repetition in the beginning of the sentences. For 6 of the sentences, beginning of the sentences or clauses or beginning of the clauses, he used the term I'd like or I'd love. And it was like, it was repetitive. So it was like, I'd like to do, or I'd like to be able to do this. I'd like to be able to do this. And so that repetition kind of shows the lack of frequency that he probably had about different types of syntax. And with all of those like sentence starters, it shows how he might not have gotten all of that education about how to, and he probably learned this is how I can answer one sentence like it, and then kept using that instead of learning a different type of sentence starters. Lastly, there was a few simple errors that he had that weren't super common throughout the rest of his writing. So one of those simple errors was he forgot the word what in a sentence. In the sentence he wrote, "I'd love to know what life was like during that period." And so instead of putting, I would love to know what life was like, he left out the word what. And then also later in the sentence or later in the passage, he misspelled the word psychological. But because those are so infrequent within his writing, it seems like those are more small errors, and that it isn't necessarily a determiner of his acquisition to English, because it wasn't very, like, as a writer myself, sometimes I would misspell the word psychological, or I'd forget a word when I was writing under a time constraint. So these are completely simple errors that might not be due to his acquisition, but rather just overall errors that might have just happened as a normal writer. So those are all of the written and syntax errors that I found. So we're going to move on to the teaching recommendations for each of the sections.
So returning back to phonetics, we're going to have 4 teaching recommendations for the 5 production errors that we found. The first would be the eth adjustment. And while this is a small phonetical error, it is very significant. As we had said previously, this comes up in very common, simple words in everyday speech. So this would begin as discussing on a very basic level, mouth position and voice usage. And this would start with using theta, which is also a dental fricative. It is just voiceless because this sound is more natural to Vietnamese speakers than eth. So we would begin with that pronunciation and slowly transition from voiceless to voiced and practice drills. So we would transition there. And that's just kind of thinking meta phonologically about how you're saying things and the similarities and differences between different phonemes. The second would use a vocal model to discover the deletion errors. This would involve stages of recognizing, observing, and participating. So after listening to a model, he could identify the blends and see them written on a sheet of paper, as well as these sounds kind of spelled out in a way that he might not catch on to as someone simply speaking them to him, because the sounds, as the name suggests, they kind of cluster and blend together. So this would be similar to the previous recommendation, where you focus on mouth position and voice usage, and beginning with the basic building block of even producing that sound in the first place, and then transition to putting it into words and with different consonant clusters and passages. This also may include the insertion of vowels between each consonant to allow for an easier proficiency. And then later on, once that could be completed, you would delete the vowels. And that would also consist of a lot of drills. The ED deletion, we would have an emphasis on the D deletion, because the ID and T pronunciations of the suffix were a lot better. They were not perfect, but the most significant production error was the D. So this would, identifying this and narrowing down what type of pronunciation needs to be adjusted would be more beneficial. So we could use a wide variety of consonant combinations and just the practice and production. Yeah, we would practice production of different consonant combinations. He's already aware of the morphology behind it. He needs to master it rather than just be proficient. Yes, and so far all of these, all three of these teaching methods are based off of recognizing, observing, and then participating in drills. So the three of those are kind of the same thing in a way, just with different phonemes and deletion errors. The fourth one, however, with tonal inflection, is going to be a little bit of a different lesson plan. So this will include poem analysis, and poems are a great way to illustrate stress and cadence and rhythm. So first we would look at a poem in Vietnamese, either spoken by the subject or read from a video of some kind. And then we would reflect on the cadence and rhythm. We would have it written out on a sheet of paper and make notes of where stress occurs and where there is cadence and emphasis on certain words. Then we would look at a poem in English that is read aloud and do the same thing with the written portion and identify where stress occurs and how the rhythm of a poem would go. And then we would read a different poem in English or a different passage and record the subject's voice, and then reflect on that recording and make comparisons to the Vietnamese cadence and the English cadence to see if there were errors. And that's just another way to kind of think metalinguistically. So I think a combination of all these would greatly change his accent to become as close as mainstream American English as possible.
For the morphological recommendations, I have a couple. So with the subject verb agreement, I would provide a lesson on when to add the S endings. And so when you add that is when you have to make so for the morphological recommendations, I have 4. For the first one, the subject verb agreement, I would provide a lesson on when to add the S ending. So subject verb agreement is all about making sure that the verb and the subject agree in terms of plurality. So in his case, the sentence, I like how stuff works. He said, I like how stuff work. So the subject stuff is plural while the verb work is singular. So I would explain to him how this works and give him a worksheet where he would have to fill in himself, either changing the subject or changing the verb to fit the agreement. For plurality, I would provide another lesson on conjugating verbs and identifying direct and indirect objects. For this one, I have 2 different ways of giving the lesson because his issue that I found is when the part of the sentence for him, the verb changes and becomes something else, a noun. So in the sentence, I take walk in park, the verb walk became the indirect object and take is the verb. The worksheets that I would give him would have some of the sentences, the verb would say the verb, and some sentences, the verb would change structures. And then the other lesson I would have is conjugating a verb. So like for the verb walk again, I'm just going to keep using walk because that's the word that he messed up on. So for it's I walk, he walks, she walks. And so I would just reiterate how you add an S depending on the verb tense. For pronouns, he did not have an issue of leaving the pronoun I out completely. It was just some parts. So for example, sentence, he said, I finished my test, so just leave. So he started the sentence with I, but in the end of the sentence, he didn't use I again. So I'd reinforce that mostly every single time you would refer to yourself as I, you need to refer to yourself as I. So there are exceptions to the rule, like compound sentences. So if he were to say, I went to the park and saw trees, he would not necessarily need to say, I went to the park and I saw trees. For that instance, you can drop the I, but I would just reiterate that if it doesn't sound exactly right, then you probably need the pronoun I. And for articles, I would provide another lesson explaining when to use the appropriate articles. So for indefinite articles, which are a and an, they are for non-specific nouns and single count nouns. So like if you were to say, I have an apple, he would need an, or I have a boat, he would use a. And for indefinite articles is just the. So like it's specific members of a group. And sometimes there are sentences that you don't need articles, which is with plural nouns. So for my recommendations, I would just have lessons and give him worksheets that he would need to do.
Moving on to the written syntax and morphological recommendations, I focused on 4 different plans. I left out about the random errors that he had because I don't think that they necessarily need to be taught versus the 4 that were more frequent throughout his writing prompt. So to combat each of these issues, I focused on the 3P method, the present, practice, and produce. So first with the conjugation, I want to combine the 2 points of plurality and tense and kind of explain how when one changes, it changes another part of the situation or another part of the sentence in both instances with plurality and tense. So first I would introduce all of the different tenses and how they change with plurality. And then I would specifically focus a lot on the passive versus the perfect past, which is what he had a lot of trouble with because it's a more advanced tense. And so I'd go over that. And then I would provide different phrases to him and then have him change them from one tense to another, one plurality to another, just to kind of get him more in the hang of practicing with different types of sentences, and then combining that with changing both plurality and tense at the same time. Then I would, for him to produce, I would let him have examples of different sentences and how he would change the plurality and tense of that on his own time for him to dissect it and then come back with any issues. Moving on to the prepositions, because it wasn't necessarily a basic issue with prepositions, I don't want to just focus on like the using pictures as a model. I would rather focus on modeling spatial versus abstract prepositions. So for example, looking at in the box versus in my opinion, or on the desk versus on the telephone. So just kind of showing the difference between those two. First, I would provide pictures for the more basic preposition issues, and then I would show why using pictures might not work as well with the abstract prepositions, and that would kind of help him practice with those. And then to let him practice, I would go ahead and give him more examples to look at home, and just kind of looking at the difference between the two, the abstract and the preposition, or the abstract and the spatial. Moving on to the punctuation errors. First, I would explain how to combine clauses with comma and when it is not necessary. So a lot of the times he would like use a comma before the word but, which is sometimes necessary, sometimes not, and that can be confusing as you start to get it into more complex sentences. But by comparing like simple versus complex versus compound complex, and just like going over the basic rules of those, that'll help him kind of cut down on those run-on sentences and show him exactly where the comma should go. And then a fun lesson to kind of visualize where that is you could make like little like sentence strips and combine the clauses and see where a comma could be used to combine that. Why maybe combining 3 sentence strips might work sometimes and might not work other times. Continuing on, I would send him home with specific work to look at longer winded sentences versus shorter sentences and how those commas should be included. And then the last one would be in the repetition of sentences that we saw. This one as well, I would just focus on like putting into his mind the different types of sentences, because it seems as though whenever he was first taught, he saw this way to answer a sentence and that's the only way that he uses. So I would explain to him for the present part of it, I would explain the different types of basic sentence structures and how you can move those around and how it's not as formulaic as his teachings might have taught him at first. And then moving on to the practice, I would give him just basic questions that normally he would just answer in a certain way to, but ask him to go over different types of like different ways to respond to that question in different orders. So changing up the sentence order to say the same thing, but structured different so he can have varied sentence structures. And then again, to produce, I would give him other questions to continue to practice that, see how he's give him a paper to write, and then see if he uses those varied sentences throughout the papers. So basically, it's a lot of introducing the topic, practicing, and then producing. And this will just help him get that repetitiveness and see if he has taken that information on and see how he is producing that information. So now we will be moving on to our conclusion.
So you can come to a couple of conclusions based on our research. Our subject had made more errors towards phonological aspects of L2 learnings. Of course, he did make some in the morphological and syntactical side, but I think the more pronounced ones were in phonology. Even though he did have some errors, these errors are very minimal and are not prohibiting him from effectively communicating in English. The instruction that we have made for him was made specifically for this subject. He is more of an advanced learner of English, so we made the instruction more for an advanced learner. Since we use an older subject, instructors are able to learn what areas Vietnamese learners truly struggle with. For example, we know that the Vietnamese learners are going to struggle with articles and the pronoun I because there's no equivalent. And from this subject, we can tell that even with as much learning as the subject has, he still is going to struggle with that. And with this research, we are able to provide instructors with more precise and effective ways of teaching Vietnamese learners English.
Just wanted to give you a thank you for listening to our presentation. We hope you enjoyed. We had a lot of fun making this, so we just appreciate you listening in and learning more about our subjects. So thank you. And here are our references.